All right, welcome back to the Hogtown Podcast, episode 46.
First episode of the new year.
First episode of the new year. We had Dan DeBow on our last episode, which was like really interesting and great. We have a guest scheduled for our next episode, so I think we wanted to do a quick what's going on in housing policy, what's going on in the news kind of update before we kind of went from one guest to another.
Yeah, not that a ton happens over the holidays typically, but there's definitely some stuff that's sort of like in flight. We're also rolling into an election year in Toronto. So there's a couple of topics. This might be a quick episode, but figured we'd just do a quick recap on everything that's going on, just because next episode we're likely going to dive into a couple of specific topics and maybe not do an overall outlook. So where did you want to start?
Yeah, so there were a few things that I think we have talked about a little bit on the podcast, but it's worth doing a quick update on. So the first thing I have is the Avenues study update. So for people who've been listening for a while, you might remember that the city has been conducting this avenue study to upzone the city's avenues for more mid-rise development. There was a 3-phased process. It's weird because they have these phases, and then within phases they have stages because they can't do it cleanly. But anyway, the first phase was so avenues are like major streets in the city that have been designated specifically for mid-rise development, and mid-rise development at a scale that is proportional to the size of the right-of-way.
Yeah.
So typically, on a 20 meter right of way, you might be at like 6 to 8 stories. If you're at 36 meters, you might be 11 to 13 stories. So something like that.
What's that ratio? That sort of width to height ratio?
The actual mid-rise design guidelines ratio is 1-to-1, but people are pushing beyond that, and the kind of like emerging context among approved plans is to push a little further. For context, on Dufferin, we have this project on Dufferin, which is a 20-meter right-of-way, expanded avenue. We're at 8 stories. City planning, urban design, and the council's office don't really have a big problem with it.
Yeah.
Anyway, so in 2013, these avenues were first designated in the city on the official plan map. And then we've been going through this exercise to increase the areas on these major streets that are considered avenues, capital A avenues. Phase 1 was basically a new map expanding these areas. That was passing council last week. We've talked about that. The next phase was to take these new avenues, which are kind of delineated on a map, and the city has to update the official plan to redesignate these. They're largely neighborhoods designated lands, so to redesignate them as either mixed-use areas or apartment neighborhoods, which would allow for more intensification. And the idea was that it was going to be originally a 3-phase work study. So phase 1, draw the map. Phase 2, update the official plan. Phase 3, update the zoning bylaw. Of course, in an election year, we have an election coming up municipally in October. That was way too simple and maybe way too fast. So this has been broken out into multiple phases. And then again, each phase now has multiple stages. So phase 2 is now just focused on Toronto East York. So redesignating in the official plan some of these areas in Toronto East York. And then again, I mentioned stages. There are 3 stages within phase 2. Stage 1 was a few streets that were highlighted, and we'll talk about that. Stage 2 and stage 3 will cover the rest of the streets. So all that's happened since we last talked about getting to the actual point of this update is that the stage 1 official plan amendments passed in council in late December. So these were OPAs 861 and 862. If anybody's really interested in this, if you're a real estate developer and you want to understand what sites this opens up for mid-rise development, probably the best thing you could do is either Google or ChatGPT OPA 861 and 862. 861 was for areas within major transit station areas, and 862 is for areas outside the major transit station areas. That's why it was 2 official plan amendments. And maybe I'll pause there because you've had a chance to look at these maps.
Yeah.
We're not yet at a point where Natasha could overlay the maps on the video, but we'll so for now, just pull it up at home. But yeah, let's get your thoughts on how that went.
I mean,
it was a pretty uncontested vote, I'll say, which is the first thing at council.
Which tells you that it was probably incredibly timid in the way it was done. But if you go back even to when the avenues maps were first being proposed, you'll remember that there were 2 versions of those maps that were circulated. Ultimately, the second version introduced a couple of new segments of avenues, but also eliminated some sections of avenues. And we had this discussion last year around how you could sort of see the local politics playing out and how these maps.
It was largely Etobicoke.
Yeah,
had a lot of these avenues removed.
That's right. And just explicit as it could be that there are just local resident groups that are sort of directly advocating. When you look at these redesignations in OPA, I'm on OPA 862, and some of them are so you can just imagine that there's a 2-3 city staff walking the streets for the last 6 months and looking property by property and saying, hey, should we do nothing here? Should we paint this one red? Should we paint this one orange? And the context there is that orange on these maps indicates apartment neighborhoods, and red on these maps indicates mixed use. And we haven't shied away from this. I mean, our view on this has been effectively that like avenues should be mixed use almost by definition. Because
the difference for people who don't know is mixed use area, you could build residential or commercial or mixed. Orange, you could only build residential, and to the extent that you include any commercial, it could only be called, small scale retail. So if you picture these old kind of like Scarborough, Etobicoke, Tower in the Park neighborhoods, they might have like a convenience store, but you couldn't do like a grocery store.
But they also
gym.
tend to be with big front yard setbacks. They tend to have massive side yard separations between buildings.
That's right. Yeah, the city's probably going to require different setback requirements for orange versus red.
And when you look at like what we're looking at, like just as an example, I was just looking at the corner of College and Dufferin, which is an area that I know relatively well. And there's on the north side of Dufferin, they've done nothing to redesignate. On the south side of Dufferin, they're going to apartment neighborhoods. So my sense is the north side is probably already mixed use, and it didn't require any change. But if you look at that on Google Maps, it's very explicit. These are like retail storefronts that are side by side in a mixed use pattern that have been there for 50, 60, 70 years in some cases. And the city's made the decision to go for apartment neighborhoods here. There's no logical reasoning for this, right? And you map by map, you can see they've skipped over properties where they just say, hey, we're going to do it on this property, but not on this property.
They've skipped over whole like blocks.
Entire blocks that have been skipped over. So, I suspect if you dive into this, and maybe I'll do this for the fun of it ahead of a future episode.
For context for people, this is a lot of Dufferin, a lot of College, a lot of Christie, a lot of Ossington. I don't have the full list of streets, but it's that kind of part of town.
Yeah, and like there's properties that have just been excluded from the redesignation and blocks that have been excluded. So, this is, again, one of these things where it's a step in the right direction. We've been critical of the city for not moving fast enough. They're moving here, moving slowly and moving in a way. My sense is if city council unanimously votes in support of one of these things, it means they haven't pushed the envelope far enough, because you almost need some councillors to be pushing back. If not, you're just not moving the needle. So, I don't know what the long-term impacts of this are, other than the fact that you're probably still going to see sites outside of these redesignated areas going through OPAs and ZBAs to get built. I don't think it's going to restrict people from building mid-rise outside of these new painted areas. It just means that the process doesn't get faster or simpler.
Yeah, because again, a lot of these avenues, well, actually, all avenues are on major streets, and there's a separate major street permission for 6-story permissions if there is no redesignation, if it's still neighborhoods designated land.
Yeah.
So you still have that permission, but again, as you mentioned, like not only are these setback requirements going to be required on orange, but they're even larger on yellow, which is neighborhoods. Orange is apartment neighborhoods. Yeah. So I mean, I'll just echo everything you said. When we first saw the map, we thought that city planning could do this very quickly. Just repaint all of these as red, and that's it. You don't need to spend much time or many staff hours on this. And they've done a much more kind of granular block by block thing. I put out like an ask to planning friends, why does orange even exist? Like, why would they use orange at all here? And the only half reasonable answer I got back was that red typically has the city not just permitting commercial in addition to residential, but often requiring it at the ground floor. So you often see these condos on these avenues with like vacant retail space. And so orange provides more flexibility in one sense, in that you could have just residential ground floor all the way to your top floor. But to me, the answer to that is just like, don't require it in red. Red should just be like, mixed use zoning should be the same thing almost as like no zoning, which is just that like
you can build whatever you want,
what the market is telling you, it needs.
Within the prescribed height restrictions, et cetera, you're allowed to build whatever you want for whatever type of use you want. And like orange, as I think of orange, I think of it like historically as being more in like the suburban or inner suburban parts of the city.
That's exactly where it's from.
These maps are very core parts of the city where average lot sizes are like 17 to 20 feet in some cases, and you're painting orange into that lot, right? You're effectively taking away any viability for redevelopment, because there's just not going to be any space for the type of design requirements that I suspect orange.
So like as an example, Dufferin from Bloor going north, it's orange. But then if you go too far north, it's nothing. They're not changing it at all. Again, I'm not sure why. So yeah, I mean, this kind of echoes a lot of our thoughts on a lot of these city initiatives, which is like it's clearly and unambiguously a step in the right direction. But it's one of these things where like this was obvious when the avenues policy was first written out in 2013, and it's equally as obvious that they should have gone further. But it's going to take us another 12 years to go further, and it just feels like a big waste
Now,
of time.
do you have any visibility into? So you mentioned this is stage one is now been approved. Stage two is presumably started.
Yeah.
Now, are they working on phase three as it relates to stage one in parallel, or does everything need to get through?
No, it's one phase at a time, and within each phase, one stage at a time. So
Any timelines on that from the city?
phase, well, they do have timelines, but they've missed them all, so I don't think they're all that relevant anymore. Phase three, so again, phase two is Toronto East York wards, and then there are like stages within them, kind of prioritizing near subway, then kind of like near bus lines, and then everything else. Those are the three stages of phase two. Phase three is other wards outside of Toronto East York throughout the city, with some notable exceptions, like as an example, Etobicoke Center, where you have a counselor who's very opposed to all of this. And that last phase, phase four, for the remaining wards, there's no timeline at all on it. So
They carved out wards where they have counselors who are unhappy.
yeah, so they got bumped out of phase three to phase four.
Wow.
Which this whole thing initially was only
And presumably phase three is already going to be even less aggressive than this.
Yeah.
Or sorry, stage two.
That's right, because these are the ones that are closest
These are the
to transit.
easiest to justify density.
That's right.
The next stage is the more difficult ones,
Yeah.
and then the last stage is like, if anything gets approved, it'll be, it'll take an election for something to change.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that's happening in parallel that I think is worth mentioning is that the city is conducting, I think they call it the Midrise feasibility study or review.
Yeah, Jason Thorne.
So Jason Thorne, our chief planner, wants to make, again, it's one of these things where like he says he wants to make mid-rise development more feasible, and I think he does, and we'll talk about this study. But then, one big part of that is, again, this avenue study is the underlying zoning is the first thing you need to get right, and we're only kind of getting it half right. Nevertheless, the mid-rise feasibility study is ongoing. The city's retained Batory Planning, which is also our private planner on a few files to help them with that study, and they've been interviewing developers to understand what gets in the way of making mid-rise development pencil. One thing that's interesting is we've noticed, Craig kind of talked about this when he was on our podcast, Craig Race, a lot of people who have mid-rise sites are choosing to either push for higher density and go high-rise or scale it down to multiplexes. And the new missing middle seems to be this kind of like, I don't know, 4 to 8 story zone where your
6-story major streets building is actually quite difficult to make.
It's very difficult because you're getting hit with the full development charge pop, which you're not at the smaller scale. You're getting hit with the full amenity space requirements, the bike parking requirements, and all that stuff. And the city, I think, knows this, or at least they know it enough that they launched this feasibility study. And my understanding is they are reviewing things like indoor and outdoor amenity space requirements for small scale apartment buildings, soft landscaping requirements, bike parking requirements, bike maintenance facility requirements. All these things get layered on.
On the process side or on site plan approval or anything like that?
Not that I know of. Site plan approval is actually an interesting one because once you tip past 10 units, you have to do site plan control and approval, and that process should be scaled down to reflect the size of the building.
Right.
Like it doesn't make sense that it should be as extensive of a checklist and as extensive as a review period for, again, 40 units, 6 stories, as 400 units, 60 stories. But currently it mostly is. In
our experience is that site plan is almost being used to like enforce zoning ideas, even though you have an as of right permission on the zoning side. Right.
That's right.
So,
So we'll see. And I just want to mention this feasibility study because, again, this is good stuff. These OPA 861, 862 could be better, but it's good. And in addition to that, this feasibility study should help even more. And actually a third thing that's all happening around the same time that's relevant to this scale of development is, I don't know if you saw that the city launched the consultations around PMTSA upzoning.
I saw that,
So we talked about it on the podcast. I think it was August of last year. The province issued direction to the city to upzone areas within major transit station areas. So within the neighborhoods portions of these areas, 4-story permissions minimum within the MTSAs, 6-story permissions if you're within 200 meters of the station, and then on the apartment neighborhood or mixed-use designated lands, including these lands we just referenced through these other studies, minimum of 6 FSI within the MTSA, so 6 times the law area is your permitted gross floor area, or a FSI within 200 meters of the station. So that the province gave the city direction in August that it had 1 year to update its official plan and its zoning bylaw to comply with that. My understanding is that the city actually wants to get this done by like April,
Right.
which is very good, in that they'd be a bit ahead of schedule. And they've launched consultations for these. So if anybody's interested in this, the city is calling it what are they calling it? Zoning areas, or they had a term. Anyway, if you search Toronto major transit station area, you can get to the website with all the detail on the study and all the consultations. So there's like a virtual one on January 21st. That's in 10 days. And then they're having in-person consultations in Toronto, East York, Etobicoke, North York, Scarborough. And,
now, presumably, is the work that we just talked about that Jason Thorne is undertaking with Batory planning, would that be comprehensive enough to include 4 to 6 story permissions within these MTSAs that are off of avenues and major streets? Like if I'm allowed to build a 6-story building on a neighborhood street behind an avenue because it's within 200 meters of a subway station, are these design criteria going to extend to that, or is it going to be, do you know how that's being scoped?
There will be some threshold. Like the idea is that the stuff that the planning department is doing with Batory is to make what they're calling small scale to mid-rise apartment buildings more feasible. So I'm sure they're going to have a cutoff to like what that threshold is, so that if, as an example, they either eliminate your bike parking requirement, or say you could do a cash in lieu for your full bike parking requirement or something like that, it's not intended to be a full zoning bylaw update to all development, but only for this scale. So, but whenever they define that scale, yes, it would apply to all these areas that are going to be upzoned for more buildings of this scale.
Right. So and then the next shoe to drop is going to be building code changes to actually make these things more feasible. Yeah,
that's the other thing. That's the next shoe that has to drop. And we talked about the province having launched the section by section review of the Ontario Building Code. Haven't heard much about that. Looked into it actually, and the latest is that like there's no real process in place.
Right.
So they announced it, and there's no real process.
Yeah, because this context that you could build 4 stories in any major transit station area, when 4 stories is sort of this like
major threshold
dead zone for a lot of building code requirements.
You're kicking into. We've talked about this, but you're kicking into Part 3 of the building code, which comes with additional costly code requirements. And it really needs to make sense to kick into that and not just stay at 3 stories.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, just for as an illustration, we have a project that we've talked a bunch about on Glen Park Avenue, not officially a major transit station area, as it's because I guess it's been scoped out of that study, right?
A couple of stations aren't designated as major as PMTSAs, certainly, and Glencairn's one of them. Yeah.
And just to make the point, like we looked at this, so we own 3 neighboring lots on Glen Park Avenue, and we looked at this to say we could build a 6-story apartment building, call it 50 to 60 units. And it was more economically feasible for us to be building a series of 3-story multiplexes and end up in sort of the low 30 unit count. Yeah. And we're making more money as developers building about half the units because of all these thresholds. And that speaks
directly to development charge exemption, that threshold. It speaks directly to the threshold for site plan control, and it speaks directly to the Ontario Building Code parts.
But this includes the inefficiency of dual egress in every one of these buildings, side yard separations in every one of these buildings. It still makes more sense.
But even with this new plan that we're going to take advantage of these lower kind of threshold benefits, we're still going to committee with like a really long, fairly long list of variances for things like in a 9-unit apartment building. Not only do you need to provide bike parking, you need to provide a bike maintenance facility.
Which is crazy.
Which is insane. for like a 9-unit.
Which is effectively like a corner of a room where there's like a screwdriver hanging on a wire or something that you can tighten.
Yeah, so there's all these things. And then again, like you need to provide 1.5 meter of soft landscaping on the side of your property. But if you have side access and you need to kind of like pave, a ramp to your door, then that's a variance. Like all these things and my understanding of that specific example, I was talking to our planner, Greg, about this. It's basically the city looked at these old apartment buildings from like the 70s, where they were typically tower in a park, even the small versions of them that had these large setbacks, and basically just like defined how those were built as the requirement for new buildings.
Right. And which is these massive setbacks on all sides.
Yeah. Which is like an insane way to plan for the future, which is just to kind of like document what happened in the past in kind of like a built form that nobody really loves. Anyway, so just to summarize, at the municipal level, stage one of phase two of the Avenue study passed in December. We're now on to stage two of phase two. The city launched this feasibility study for mid-rise buildings, and we're expecting to see that not only the recommendations, but the actual output being passed at council within the next few months. And then this consultation for the major transit station area upzonings. And it all happens just coincidentally ahead of every year we host the Missing Middle Summit, which is for developers and aspiring developers at this scale. This is all happening, I'm expecting, based on conversations with city staff,
before the summit,
like a month before the summit. So I actually think that this will be a great time to talk about it at the summit, because I think this is going to be probably the biggest change in permissions for mid-rise development, multi-unit development. I don't know.
Maybe since
at least 2013,
yeah.
and even and even then they didn't do as much as they're doing now.
Right.
So so maybe I'll do a quick plug for anybody who hasn't been at past years. missingmiddlesummit.com. It's a full day conference where people are going to be talking about missing middle to mid-rise scale development, focused specifically on Toronto, taking you through the full life cycle of identifying a site, underwriting the site, getting debt on the site, designing a building, working with consultants,
updates on policies,
working with the builder, updates on policy. We'll have people from the city speaking to these items. We launched ticket sales, so missingmiddlesummit.com is a good one.
And now just one thing to go back and clarify, because I think on the Avenues process, I understand that phase 3, so phase 2 is the OPA changes. And then phase 3 is the zoning bylaw changes, right?
You know what? They've actually it's more complicated, because now phase 3 and phase 4 are still within the OPA phases, just for different parts of the city. And they
not stage 3 and stage 4. Oh,
no,
wow.
no.
Okay.
Stages are like further breaking down phases. The phases for the zoning bylaw.
So when did they get to the zoning bylaw?
They just scrubbed it off the website. So
because that was supposed to be the third year of the process, right?
Yeah, correct.
And now we're in the second year of the process.
Yeah. We're actually 2.5.
Okay, so that clarifies it. So no line of sight. So the idea that you're going to get past a zoning bylaw amendment with, as of right permissions is like probably not likely to happen anytime in the near future for a mid-rise building in these avenues.
Certainly not this year. And then the big question will be, could the city move faster after an election than it can before an election?
Maybe depends on who the mayor is.
Maybe depends on who the mayor is. Yeah.
And on the MTSA stuff, is the update that we're expecting either in April or let's say before the deadline in August, is that solely an OPA change?
It should be OPA and ZBA. It should be updating, because that's the direction the province gave. It should be updating the official plans and the zoning bylaws.
Actually get both done versus
the stuff that really matters. The reason why people should go out to consultations is the province did not give enough direction in my mind. All they gave was these height and FSI minimums that the city needs to meet, but there's so much more the city could do to mess it up. They could require large side yard setbacks, large front yard setbacks, large soft landscaping requirements, all these other things that neutralize sites for development. Ultimately, whatever the city passes as an official plan amendment or zoning bylaw amendment needs to be ratified by the province. So the province has one more shot at kind of like fixing anything the city does wrong. But it is really important that the city gets this right. If you think about, roughly, not exactly, but roughly 800 meters around every single subway station, GO station, and LRT station, these are all being upzoned through this exercise this year, within the next few months.
It's a big. I mean, if you think about Bloor Street as an example, that effectively encompasses all of Bloor Street, because these zones overlap each other,
and not just Bloor Street and Danforth itself, but also like the blocks going into the neighborhood. Yeah. So
massive changes coming.
Yeah. So we'll maybe we'll do. I wonder if there's a way to do an episode from a consultation. We'll look into that. Maybe something like that. Or we'll just kind of like report on it afterwards.
Yeah, we could do one of those reaction videos of a live stream consultation.
Yeah, that could be good.
Okay, cool. All right, where do you want to go next? I think the other thing we had on our docket to talk about is some early rumors of the leadership race to replace Bonnie Crombie as the leader of the Ontario Liberal Party. I mean, a few things just to note, and then we can chat about what we're hearing, is that this has already been quite a long time since she announced her resignation, and sort of been like almost no noise coming out of this process. So sort of, I don't know if that's intentional or they're just sort of getting their act together.
I think I'm sure it's intentional from some people, but other people are getting frustrated that it's a leaderless party, effectively.
Yeah, and if you look at the polls in Ontario, I mean, the NDP still show up as a distant third in absolute numbers, even though they're the official opposition, and the Liberals don't even have a leader. So it's a crazy scenario for somebody like like Doug Ford to just do whatever the heck he wants because there's
It's a
nobody
great
there,
opportunity
right?
for Doug Ford to do whatever he wants. The problem is, of course, he's
He does
not
all the
doing
wrong
enough.
things. Yeah.
But yeah, there was this morning. We saw this Toronto Star article that dropped with some names of like potential contenders, and then there was another article. What was that other outlet?
It's a Queens Park independent journalist. I forget Ahmad. Anyways, I'll pull it up.
Yeah, so a few names are floating for those of you who are interested in Ontario. We spent a lot of time talking about Ontario concerns.
Ahmad El
Politics.
Bayumi is he's the Queens Park
Yeah.
reporter who dropped the story on the possibility of one of these dark horse candidates.
Yeah, so for those of you interested in Ontario Liberal politics, some names. So Nate Erskine-Smith was second in line, or he came second after Bonnie Crombie in the last race.
That's right.
He's a pretty high likelihood contender. We've talked a lot about Nate Erskine-Smith. My general
brief
sense,
stint as federal housing minister.
yeah, a brief and extremely uneventful stint. Unfortunately, as federal housing minister, I thought that would have been a great time for him to just ram things through and have it as kind of like a CV for this, but he didn't do that. So anyway, he's one name. People were talking about Mike Crawley, who's this former federal Liberal Party president, who seems to have a lot of support among the insiders. He's kind of put up this website.
Seems sort of like an
emails.
old school Liberal guy who's maybe been around since like the early 2000s.
And like a banker, like a finance guy.
Yeah.
Rob Surgenak, I don't know if you know Rob, but
I know he's a current sitting MPP. I don't know much else.
Yeah, Rob's a current sitting MPP. He used to be Anna Bailau's chief of staff when she was in council, and when they launched what would eventually become EHON, which was originally the laneway suite permissions. That's when I first met Rob, so he was kind of involved in that. Adil Shamji is kind of like a big name, not yet clear whether he's going to run or not. And then the dark horse candidate that got announced today is a friend of ours and a former guest of the show, Eric Lombardi, who of course is also the founder of More Neighbors Toronto, and currently, I don't know what his role is, but like the executive director of Build Toronto.
Yeah, that's right.
Like that. Yeah.
And there was at one point, we can chat about Eric in a second, but there was at one point this sort of this medical doctor in Toronto who was being rumored as
what's his name? Persian name, I think.
Yeah, who's I think made a name for himself in sort of like supportive housing in Toronto and working.
Interesting guy. I don't know anything about him, so I don't mean this critically, but he's got these like glamour shots.
Yeah,
that are like clearly face tuned. He's like I don't know, funny guy. There was some like housing event where you had like, or maybe it was Toronto Life. They did this article on Toronto housing, and they had like SVP from Tricon. They had an architect, and then they had this doctor.
Yeah.
So
who I think got involved in like one supportive housing project in Parkdale.
Yeah. And again, I don't know him, so I don't. But just that's all I know about him.
Anyways,
he's Bouzeret or something like that.
That Andrew Bouzeret or Bouzeret, yeah, that's right. I mean, high level reactions at this point just seemed like there's still it still seems like a relatively light slate, but you know they're also starting from third place, so maybe the expectations are low and somebody could outperform.
I think this is like a wide open race, and like one of the, I don't know what's the right way to say this, like. You have a leadership race for a party that at some point has to form government, if history is any guide in Ontario. So this is basically the race to at some point probably be the next premier, because again, the Ontario Liberals have already churned through two leaders, and often you don't want to keep churning through leaders too quickly, or you just like lose any momentum. So whoever wins this race has a decent shot of being obviously the Liberal Party leader, but the next premier of Ontario, which is one of the best, in my mind, political jobs in the world. And to your point, it's like a race of like there's no one clear heavy hitter that's going to take everyone out. So I think it's an open race. I guess is an open.
Yeah, and Eric Lombardi potentially joining the race. I don't think he's formally announced yet. I think is interesting just for the specific issue on housing, which we've obviously made such a we spend so much time on. But I think more and more people are recognizing this is like the number one issue in the province, let alone the city of Toronto. And Eric, beyond most people, knows a ton about this issue. You know, we don't necessarily agree 100% of the time, but I'd say like 80 to 90% of the time, I'm sort of like nodding my head when Eric's talking about housing policy. So it'll be interesting to see how he frames that. It's still, you know, he's a nobody in politics, broadly speaking, not to be insulting, but like some of these people are coming at this with like, you know, decades of involvement in
but even then
politics,
only maybe Nate.
Yeah.
Like who else?
Well, like
I
this
guess
guy,
Mike Crawley.
Mike Crawley,
Yeah, which matters among the insiders. I don't think he's got like a ton of public name recognition, but it's really Nate Erskine Smith.
You
And
sort of
then,
hope that they get their act together, get going, and actually allow for like a lot of substantive debate because there's so many issues that, and the Liberal Party right now it sort of lacks any real definition in Ontario.
Yeah, it does.
And so you can sort of make it whatever you want to make it. You can make it the housing party, you can make it the homelessness party, you can make it the social justice party, whatever's like your issue, you can make it that party, right?
Taking notes from the federal Liberals. You could go as left of center to right of center as you want. Like the Liberals
somewhere
have
between
this kind of
Justin
like
Trudeau and Mark Carney is a lot of wiggle room.
Yeah,
right?
there's a ton of wiggle room, and it'll be interesting to follow. We'll have to have Eric on the show. I think my sense is that like there's probably no world where I vote Liberal, and even if Eric, who's again a friend of the show, and we agree, like you said, probably 80-90% of the time, I just don't know how much the leader could then change the underlying political
culture
calculus
of the party,
and just like what the power base is of the party.
Well, the Liberal Party relies on Toronto to get elected, and if you rely on Toronto to get elected, you rely on NIMBYs to get elected.
Yeah, and maybe Eric will prove us wrong.
Right?
I'll say there's a non-zero chance that you'd vote for an Eric OLP, but from the perspective of a conservative, it'd be nice to have the opposition force the issue a little bit more, because Doug's just been skating on like doing very little with no opposition, and it's just not a good system.
Yeah.
So that.
Well, we were going to have Eric on the show to talk about Build Toronto and updates on more housing or more Neighbours Toronto. So now we have another reason to get him on the show to let's chat Liberal politics, which is definitely not my area of depth or strength, but it'll be interesting to see how he's thinking about this.
Yeah, totally. Back to the city. A couple of quick news items I wanted to flag. So there was this story on CP24 highlighting some trends of everybody getting back to the office now starting in 2026, including the province trying to push more of the civil service to the office. And it's just highlighting how bad traffic congestion is.
Some of the stories, some of the anecdotes are hilarious. Like, they're interviewing people that have to go back on the commute, and there's like, oh, this poor woman living in Burlington who's having like anxiety attacks thinking about her commute to work. But it does point to an underlying issue that we have a growing problem in the GTA around traffic and congestion and functioning transit. I mean, we wanted to talk about the Finch LRT as an example, but this is a real issue. I mean, there's probably a couple 100,000 people that are going to be coming back to work in the next year.
Totally. Two obvious things you could do to improve congestion. One, which is more of a housing item, let more people live closer to where they work, so they have to commute less long distances. And we've talked a lot about that. And then two, build a ton of mass transit. And then you mentioned that like this one line, Finch West LRT, which is a $3.7 billion streetcar, effectively.
What an embarrassment.
It finally opened over the break, and it's running not just slower, but considerably slower than the buses it replaced.
And it's broken like 3 times already.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. Metrolinx put out this stat that it has 94% uptime as like a brag. It's like for a mass transit line, 94% uptime is
99.9 is the minimum, especially on a new transit line where there's no maintenance to be done.
You need more than 1 9.
It's funny. Toronto's
4 9s.
We've been all consumed talking about the embarrassment of the Eglinton LRT, and now that the Finch LRT is actually built, the production output of that is more embarrassing than the promise of Eglinton ever getting finished.
It's the consequence of bad ideas. This line should have obviously been separated from grade, so either below grade, which is maybe too expensive, but at minimum elevated.
Yeah.
I looked into Montreal launched this line called the REM, which is elevated rail. It cost about half per kilometer to build as this streetcar.
This Finch LRT.
So
this incredibly slow streetcar.
If we could build infrastructure not for Greek or Spanish prices, which is probably too much to ask, but for Montreal, Quebec prices, we could have had an elevated rail at a lower cost. And again, the benefit of an elevated rail is not stopping at every red light.
Well, also bear in mind that like Finch is not exactly like a part of town where you're gonna get a lot of opposition to putting elevated rail. There's some places where people are like, oh, I don't want to change the aesthetics of a neighborhood.
I think elevated rail would be perfect for Finch.
Yeah,
Finch is just not a nice street. You have all these apartment buildings with huge setbacks, large fields, a lot of community housing, and so on.
Well, this just goes to show this is not a direct criticism of the current provincial government, because I think this decision and the funding was made under the prior Liberal provincial government. But this is compromise layered on top of compromise layered on top of compromise. And there's a lot of this. I think people are underestimating how underwhelming the Eglinton LRT is going to be when it actually rolls into
because again the whole
use.
eastern 40% of it is not mixed traffic. It's got its own dedicated lane, but it's still stopping at every stop sign.
It's stopping at every
red light.
traffic light. So you have a mass transit system that stops as frequently as cars have to stop,
actually,
which is crazy.
One credit to this provincial government is they are committed to subways. And Doug Ford's brother, Rob Ford, was committed to subways. And again, like John Michael McGrath, who's also, I think, a friend, wrote for TVO that a lot of us who are saying Rob Ford was right, this should have been grade separated, are doing revisionist history because we don't remember what the cost estimates were. But fine, don't bury it, elevate it.
Yeah.
That's the obvious
There's actually a lot of places in the city where elevated rail could make sense. I think about the Queensway, Finch, massive sections of Eglinton could have been elevated.
Totally.
Kingston Road, the day they ever
We're
get to
going to get
that.
elevated rail like crosstown, the west extension as it goes through Jane, from Mount Dennis through Jane to Scarlett, and then it'll go below grade. And Doug Ford, to his credit, and this is going to be paired with the criticism, to his credit, is committed to keeping it grade separated.
Yeah.
The criticism is that we're still building this stuff for like 4 or 5 times per kilometer versus Europe. So like it just means we can't build as much as we should.
I think along Eglinton and that west extension of the LRT,
could
above grade would have been fine.
Totally.
I mean, all those houses are so separated off of Eglinton. There's like these massive dead green spaces along both sides of Eglinton. They could have saved 50% of the cost or something.
Or like the way to do tunnels, to do below grade cheaper is cut and cover. You just excavate your shore. You cut a trench and then you cover it. But again, like politicians don't like that because it's more disruptive in the short term. But
well, the problem with something like Finch West LRT, which is so frustrating, is that these are the types of infrastructure decisions that can never be undone or redone or remade. Right? Like that decision's been made. It was poorly made. We spent the money. It's a bad output, and now we're stuck with it for 50 to 100 years.
I've talked to people who were involved in those days at Metrolinx. One guy in particular, I won't name his name just in case. This is off the record. I don't remember, but there was a plan that was drawn that was costed for Crosstown to go elevated in the eastern portion, so that it goes from tunnel to elevated, and it was as easy as just going this versus that. But at the time, there was this big commitment to Transit City, which was a David Miller initiative to do basically streetcars, but LRTs everywhere, and the mood was against it.
Brutal.
And the cost. So to your point, it's like there's someone making this decision versus that one. Now 20 years later, and for the next 100 years, we're gonna have to pay for it. Yeah. At the same time, the city. So again, congestion is worsening. We're building transit half-assedly, generously, and the city. I don't know if you saw this. Appointed a new traffic czar. Which is kind of funny because we used to have a chief congestion officer.
This is the same. It's the same title. I read the traffic czar is sort of like the nickname they've given him, but it is a chief congestion officer. And I guess he's a newly appointed chief congestion officer that officially started his job last week, but he was announced back in December.
Okay. I don't know what you think about that. Like this reminds me of the last chief development or chief congestion officer or whatever it was. Like I'm trying to find this quote.
Well, I mean, like my quick read while you're looking that up is that these things are irrelevant unless you empower these people with real authority and real like tools to make change. And like the tools that are needed to make change on traffic and congestion are not going to be available to this bureaucrat. They're policy tools that need to change, right? So things like tolling, certain parts of the city and certain roads in and out of the city.
Almost like at least the last one was even worse than that because I totally agree. Like, again, I think the solutions here are basically bring houses closer to jobs, 1, 2, build more mass transit, and 3, congestion pricing.
Yeah.
And I don't think you could solve this without probably all 3.
And this guy's job sounds like it's like coordinating construction between Metrolinx and the city.
Yeah. And getting more like flagging.
Which is not a bad thing, but it's a marginal improvement.
But what's worse than them being disempowered, we'll give this new guy the benefit of the doubt. But the last guy, and his title was the director of traffic management. This is a quote. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter. He was talking about congestion pricing. He was asked about it in council. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter how much you charge. If you're going to take an approach of drawing a box around the city and then imposing the sort of charge that anyone that has to do business or anyone that has to bring goods or services into the city, they still have to do that. They would just pass that charge on to the consumer. This is contradicted by basically every single empirical study of every single congestion pricing scheme of the last 100 years. But he just says it as like, this doesn't. And it's one thing to say like, I am not empowered through provincial legislation or municipal direction to talk about congestion pricing. It's another thing to say that congestion pricing wouldn't help when like this, what he's supposed to represent, which is a field of technical study, is completely opposed to this idea.
So anyway, I do think that we shouldn't expect too much out of this new chief congestion officer. I think ultimately the tools sit with the province first and foremost, because the city really can't do much on this without the province agreeing to it.
I looked into this doesn't help, but the specifics on that, the province wrote into the City of Toronto Act that it could not toll highways.
Right.
Now, you wouldn't really want congestion pricing on everything but highways. You would want it probably on highways first and then everything else maybe second, as Singapore has done. But yeah, I think the broader point is that if it tried literally anything along these lines,
like it did the province could change the act.
Yeah, like it did with speed cameras.
Yeah, that's right. And bike lanes and whatever else, right? It can contest the city if they don't like it, and I think this is the type of thing that you wouldn't find the Ford government supportive of.
It's worth mentioning. I think this is lost on the Ford government, but every time congestion pricing has been implemented in the Western world, including most recently this cordon pricing scheme in New York, public polling has it as most negatively viewed immediately before it's implemented. And in public perception, just slowly and then steadily increases over time until it's net popular. Yeah. And it's because it's one of these things where you just have to drive in Toronto with less traffic and think, oh, actually, this is pretty good.
You just have to drive on the 407 during gridlock on the 401 to appreciate congestion pricing tolling, right? Not to say that it's not inexpensive and doesn't have sort of some secondary effects on people that can't afford these things, but it's pretty obvious.
Okay, maybe the last thing I'll bring up, which is also municipal, because a lot of these things ultimately come down to leadership. We mentioned there was a municipal mayoral election happening in October this year.
With only one confirmed candidate so far.
With only one confirmed candidate, Brad Bradford, who's been on the show. The big thing with Brad has always been, as far as the political calculus, whether or not he could win if John Tory ran. And I mean, the answer is no. He can't win if John Tory runs, not because John Tory would then definitely win, but at minimum they would split the vote between themselves. There really has to be one serious non-Olivia Chow contender, and this has always been kind of the hedge, I think, in a lot of predictions on who will be our next mayor. Is what is John Tory going to do? Is he going to announce? John Tory, by temperament, doesn't make quick decisions. So this has always been an interesting thing to speculate on. And I came into the office on Tuesday last week, and then Louis, our construction project manager, mentioned that Brad Bradford and John Tory were kind of chit-chatting and yucking it up on 1010, which I couldn't believe because
they're supposed to be opponents.
They're supposed to be opponents. And then I looked it up, and sure enough, on January 8th, they were hanging out on the radio on News Talk 1010, talking shit about Olivia Chow and the proposed budget. No inside knowledge beyond this is interesting. And this suggests to me, if there is going to be a deal between them, that one of them supports the other so that they don't run against each other. The first step is that they talk. Second step is that they're seen to be friendly in public. And I think we're on the second step, which I think is pretty interesting.
Yeah, so we'll see. I mean, the one interesting thing in this race is that Olivia Chow has yet to announce. I think the speculation is that she will announce that she's running, but it doesn't seem like there still seems to be a little bit of question mark around that because she's barely eking ahead in the polls. And so she might be really interested in the John Tory, Brad Bradford dynamic too, because I'm sure she doesn't want to run in a race she thinks she's going to lose, and she's not popular enough for this to be a home run for her. So we'll see.
The thing that's interesting about the dynamic, I could imagine what Tory could offer Bradford. He could say, "You'll be my deputy mayor. You'll be the chair of the Planning and Housing Committee again, and then in 4 years, not only will I not run, but I'll endorse you." And John Tory is still a pretty popular
guy. That assumes
guy.
That Brad could win his seat back in council.
That assumes he could win his seat back in council. But I don't know what Brad could offer Tory to not run. So that's just an interesting thought. So and then
no, I think Tory not running just has to come from John saying, that's right. You know what, I don't have it in me.
There's no deal. Yeah. And if Tory has something to offer Brad, and the only thing that it's up to is whether or not Brad accepts it. If I were Olivia Chow, I'd be pushing them both through back channels to not give in to the other.
Yeah, exactly.
So we'll see what happens. The idea that if Brad is not the mayoral candidate, and again, we have no idea, the ultimate candidate on election day. Some people think he wouldn't win his ward back because as he's become more vocal in his quest to become mayor, he's been more polarizing. I don't know how true that is. I looked into this. Beaches East York has 85,000 registered voters in municipal elections, and you win your councilor's race with 15,000. And to me, just on name recognition alone, being the two-time incumbent,
Yeah,
I
but
don't.
name
I don't.
recognition works both ways. I mean, I remember, and this is anecdotal, but I remember Anthony Furey's attempt to run in the by-election when that Don Valley West seat in
Yeah.
council came
Yeah.
up. It was so contentious because of his brand that the entire opposition mobilized in that one ward, right? So if you're
Yeah.
polarizing enough, I think you can
That
see
could
a
be it,
lot of
but that was a by-election, so the opposition had nothing else to
right,
do but
right,
mobilize for like here you're gonna have every race is up for grabs, and you have like let's say presumably it'd be Progress TO mobilizing against Brad.
right.
They have to take care of Amber Morley in Etobicoke South.
Oh, and Olivia Chow.
They have to take care of Olivia Chow.
Yeah, yeah.
Apparently, Paula Fletcher might not be running, so they'll have a new candidate in whatever that ward's called, Paula Fletcher's ward, just east of the DVP. To me, it's good. I don't know. And also, Anthony Furey was not a two-time incumbent.
Yeah, no, that's right.
Uh, I think my guess is that's overstated because people talk
But you can definitely see, I think the argument is that Brad's politics have shifted to being more like right of center in a ward that I think historically would not have been characterized as right of center.
That's true, but I
Right.
think all the people that hate him extra now didn't like him to begin with and never voted for him to begin
Yeah,
with. There
yeah, fair
were
enough.
like he did run against NDP candidates. So I don't know. One scenario that I'll put out there is Brad takes a beat. John Tory's the candidate. Brad supports him, wins his councillor seat, becomes chair of the Planning Housing Committee and deputy mayor. 4 years from now, there's a passing of the baton. I don't know. Maybe I'm just calling that based on this one
Here's
CFRB 1010 clip.
my non-conventional prediction is that Brad drops out and runs for the Ontario Liberal leadership.
Oh, interesting. You know what?
I think it would actually pretty. I don't have any reason to believe that this is true, but now that I think about it, it'd be a pretty interesting play for him, considering the slate of candidates and his profile.
Two bald guys from Beaches, East York, going for the top.
Yeah, but I know which bald guy I'd vote for between those two.
Easy.
At least one leaned into his baldness and shaves his head. The other one still tries to comb it over.
Yeah. Shout out to NES. I don't think there's much love lost between them either. No, I like Brad municipally. I think.
Yeah, but again, this question about who's going to run, John or Brad.
Yeah.
John's had his shot.
But anyway, at least they're talking now. Is the main update.
And I will say, like, one thing to know, and this is not explicitly about one video that I saw Brad post, but I saw Brad post a video last week. I guess we're gearing up for the municipal budget, in which there's an expected tax increase that Olivia Chow is going to be supporting 2.2% on property taxes. And so he did this video sort of like outlining like how the city's budget works and why effectively these things all roll down to property taxes, because municipalities are not allowed to carry debt in the funding of their operations. But it's interesting how he frames this explainer video is when he's showing the track record of tax increases over the last several years. He not only shows the tax increases in the Olivia Chow years, he shows the tax increase in the last year of John Tory's time as mayor.
Yeah.
And so he does take these little sort of subtle jabs because he's trying to make
are
the
totally
case
deserved.
that John represents sort of like the status quo that we're trying to get away from, not the change that the city needs.
That's his best angle. And I think he's totally right. Like, we talk a lot about development charge hikes. Olivia Chow increased development charges by 40% when she was mayor, but they were increased many, many times under John Tory. And I think that's a totally fair line of attack.
The way the budget's going, like I don't follow this stuff super closely, but I know that over the last between 2024 and 2025, the budget increased by over 10%.
Yeah.
That's way above just like the CPI increases in cost of services and delivery. And I think the expectation is that we're going to see something in the high single digits again this year in terms of budget increases. Unsustainable very, very quickly.
Yeah. There's always this thing in politics where it's like, who do you like best? What ideas do you like best versus what is the realistic path to power?
Yeah.
And there's always like some trade-off. So yeah.
Anyways, something to watch, and we'll make an effort to get Brad back on the show, and I don't know, maybe we'll get lucky and get John Tory on the show as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll go for it. Okay, that's all I got.
I think that's it. And I think our expectation, unless things change, is that our next episode is going to be with our friend Scott Aitchison, who is the Conservative Member of Parliament in, what's his name of his riding? Up in Muskoka something. Huntsville, Muskoka, whatever.
Yeah.
But also the Conservative critic for housing in Parliament in Ottawa. So we've had him on the show before and looking forward to having him back on. So tune in for that. And thanks for being on, and subscribe, share. And if you're new to our YouTube channel, make sure you click that like button. Thanks a lot.
All right.